Welcome to the 79th episode of Dialogika, a podcast between two friends about the latest in society, politics, and feminism in Indonesia and the world. I'm Stephanie Tangkilisan.
And I'm Sweetian Lee. And this week we have a very special guest,
Barry Beagen, who's an architect and urban planner who's currently the program director at Kota Kita,
an NGO working on building resilient cities and fighting climate change.
We're going to talk about climate change and its risks to Indonesia and Indonesian cities, and what's going on in terms of like mitigation and adapting to these risks,
as well as our hopes and dreams about what Indonesia, especially with the new government, can do to move the conversation forward and make real progress, not just at the government level, but also at the local level and certainly at the individual level. So, here's to it.
This week we have a very special guest, my friend Barry Beagen. And Barry, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes. Hi guys, my name is Barry Beagen. I'm the program director for Kota Kita Foundation. It's an urban planning NGO based in Indonesia, and we currently work in governance, inclusivity, and climate change resilience. We have been around for 10 years, and we focus on building bridges between citizens and the government. And in fact, more recently, I think we're working together with private sector as well in the mix. And I think our work ranges quite a bit from sort of more grassroots, working together with communities to design and plan for themselves, and all the way to more strategic planning with cities and also national level advocacy, right? And in fact, one of the projects that we're currently working on right now is developing a country report for urban resilience targeting the urban poor in Indonesian cities.
And that's like all super really interesting and important to talk about. But I think today we kind of want to focus on your work in climate change mitigation and planning for changes in our climate. Because I think a lot of the conversations that we hear in the media around climate change has been pretty general, and I think I'm personally curious about what are the particular risks in Indo itself, and where are the risks and who are at risk, kind of.
This is going to be a big topic.
Yeah.
But let's start with the risks. I think in sort of the study of risk, we know that there are three terms, right? There's hazards, there's vulnerability, and then there's exposure. And let's start with exposure. Our country. We're made up of more than 17,000 islands, and our economy is largely dependent on coastal cities. About 73% of our population is found on coastal cities that are largely exposed to sea level rise, and also a lot of other impacts like more drastic storm surges and also islands that are disappearing.
Right.
This increases the exposure part. And in terms of vulnerability, I think we are looking at a few things. There's institutional and also the way that our cities are currently structured. Right. A lot of cities along the north coast of Java are sinking. In fact, it's not so much because of sea level rise only, but it's actually sinking much faster than the sea level is rising, because the way the water is used, because of geomorphologies, a lot of the coast is sitting on soft soil, but it's being exacerbated by groundwater extraction and also overdevelopment. Right? So, and a lot of our communities are also vulnerable because they may not have the capacity to bounce back after a flood or a storm surge. So they're impacted by it. And in the same way, our cities can be said to be more vulnerable than cities that are more prepared, because our institutions may not be set up to counter some of these disasters.
So what like physically happens when you're extracting water and then building really heavy stuff on top of it?
Right. So, well, take a wet sponge. That's sort of what our ground is like.
Yeah.
If you try to extract the water out from above, the sponge
Sinks
shrinks,
down, yeah.
right? And that on top of weight of development, and so that's sort of the mechanism that happens and it's irreversible, unlike a sponge,
Right.
because when the clay layers the water is depleted, the aquifer is depleted,
And everything just gets compressed, right?
correct.
Besides Jakarta, which I think most people know is sinking, what are the other big cities
Right. There are a few. So there's Semarang, there's Surabaya, Pekalongan as well. And actually the other method of sinking, sort of the mechanism of sinking, is also from peatland oxidization. And peatland oxidization is largely found in Sumatra and also in Borneo. And so cities like Pontianak is also sort of susceptible to land subsidence.
When you say peatland oxidization, what do you exactly mean by that? Is it the burning of peatland or is it something else?
So the peatland oxidization happens when the soil is exposed to air, and a lot of it happens after when it's being drained. This is similar to a big chunk of Netherlands, right?
Yeah.
Or it's being converted to other uses for agriculture.
I feel a little bit like, as with the case with Jakarta, right? It was a case of overdevelopment by infrastructure. This seems to me a little bit of like overdevelopment by another means. Like you never let the land recover enough. You just keep using it and using it and using it. And then now we're in the state we're in.
I think a lot of it is always in the intersection of, urbanization.
Yeah.
And sort of like development. I mean, in some ways, the development of agriculture and let's say palm oil plantations, those are being consumed in the cities, right? So in some ways, these are all also extensions of urbanization.
Yeah.
Broadly. Yeah, and it's a matter of how well we can manage or predict these changes and actually want to control them.
Who are the people who are most at risk within?
The people who are most at risk, unfortunately, are the ones who are already vulnerable in itself, right? So the urban poor, the marginalized, and those are, a lot of people with very little capacity to sort of bounce back.
Yeah.
The thing to note is that it's not just the most poor, right? But it's the people who are sort of at the brink of poverty. Imagine it's a little bit like the whole healthcare argument, right? So as soon as you hit a disaster and there's no social protection and you have to suddenly spend, and it disrupts your cash flow and the way that you work, like that, without any support, you could be very well get stuck at the cycle.
It tips you over the edge, right? Like,
Right.
you might not have been under the poverty line, but you're one disaster away. from it.
Exactly. Yeah, because everything then adds up.
Could you walk us through like one of your projects and how, what that looks like and how that experience has been trying to like, do what you do?
Yeah. I think it can be kind of hard to visualize exactly what you do.
Maybe we could go to Semarang. So we've spent quite a bit of time there. In fact, I started on this project the moment I got back to Indonesia. The larger program is called Water as Leverage, and this was initiated by the Dutch government. The brainchild of Henk Ovink. He's the special envoy for water from the Netherlands, right? And he was involved in. You could say he was the one who initiated Rebuild by Design in New York, right? Where after Sandy, the problem of disaster resiliency. And
So
climate
Hurricane
change.
Sandy was a really huge hurricane that hit the coast of New York and caused a lot of power outages and really destroyed like certain parts of New York.
I think it really brought to light to a lot of Americans the reality and the true costs and consequences of climate change in a way that they probably have never thought about before.
Right. So then I think after that experience, there's a thought, okay, so what are some of the most vulnerable cities in the world? And a lot of them are found in South and Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
So the Waters Leverage program was looking at 3 cities to start with, which was Semarang, Indonesia, Chennai, India, and Khulna, Bangladesh.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And we happened to be working in the team in Semarang, and this was a big team that had hydrologists, urban designers, urban planners, NGOs, academics working together. And I think that this was to look at how you can conceptualize water urban projects in the city.
Right.
And this was quite interesting because Rebuild by Design in New York was a program that was started as a reaction to a disaster
Mm-hmm.
in one of the most powerful countries, the wealthiest cities in the world.
Yeah.
So the reaction was supported by $50 billion,
Yeah.
right? The Waters Leverage program was trying to use a very small sum of money to support a sort of this action research and concept building to actually create bankable projects
Right.
from the ground up. So that was the ambition. I will get to where this leads us to next, right? So this, when you talk about bankability in the world of infrastructure and urban planning, is that you end up in the terms of what the development banks, how the development banks are thinking, and how the country is thinking about infrastructure. So then you get back into the commercial viability, return on investments, and so things like water treatment plant makes sense because you can sell the water when you treat it.
Yeah.
Toll road makes sense because there's toll road concessions and fees. But when it comes to more integrated projects where you actually have to do the urban planning and has to do with real estate development and institutions and enforcement, now your metrics is all out of whack.
Yeah.
You don't know like what is the return on investment on improving monitoring of groundwater extraction.
How can you make this financially sustainable in the first place?
And it's like kind of unfair to place this burden on this project as opposed to...
Well, it's not that it was unfair. In fact, we actually tried to use that as a challenge. So we actually challenged the brief to say like, okay, let's not focus on typical projects because we know where the low-hanging fruits are, right? Seawall, pumps, dikes, water treatment plants. So we ended up, as a team with the city of Semarang to propose sort of 5 programs that have longer term impact.
Right.
Things like controlling the sort of land use in the upland area so that you can manage water better.
Yeah.
To leverage the ongoing big infrastructure projects like the toll road on the coast, to develop protection systems, but also use that opportunity to solve the problem of management in the industrial areas, right? And also improving the water supply. But these projects do not just come online immediately.
Of
They
course.
take a long time. And, let's say one of the programs that we propose was to, use this opportunity where they're trying to build a toll road and seawall along the coast in Semarang. We know that the land value is going to go up if the land is protected, right? Because right now it floods every evening.
Yeah.
And how do you use that opportunity for the land value increase to actually, incentivize the government or maybe other investors to sort of reacquisition the industrial area? Because right now the industrial areas are undermanaged. And the reason why a lot of groundwater extraction happens in Indonesia is because the industrial areas they're undermanaged, so they don't have centralized systems for water supply. And this goes back to our question of where do we want to go with manufacturing in Indonesia, right? If we don't have the proper infrastructure, if we're just dependent on these types of industries to participate in trade, I think so in some ways, investing in sort of climate change resilience can also mean investing in better manufacturing capacity.
And there's like an impact in other industries, like it's going to benefit other industries beyond those that are just directly related to climate change and climate change initiatives.
Right. Yeah. So I think, we're right now only talking about the concepts.
Yeah.
But I think, I want to say a little bit about what is the uptake on the ground, right? Because it's always very easy to produce a vision and concepts. And in some ways, we did a lot of work sort of to engage this collaboratively with the city itself.
Right.
So a lot of the thinking and the knowledge of how to strategically plan for this and these complex interrelated things and how you might solve that then gets taken up by some of the city agency officials that have been working closely with us, right? And they then become these champions for the ideas, and it's going to continue on to sort of in their planning process. And I think that's the most important part. We ourselves don't know what the impact will be yet, but we're sort of in continuous conversation about how this works. When there's an opportunity to bring this up to the national government or things like that, then we will do it.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, just coming out of the meeting that I was in before, we just learned about this policy that the government has about reforestation, and this was since 2012. Okay, I'll have to get back to it, but we have a policy on reforestation fund.
Reforestation,
right? And this fund is actually coming from actually the sort of actors in that field, right? So the companies that are in mining and energy and in the paper and pulp industries, like they can actually contribute to this fund. And apparently we do have a surplus of that fund, but the mechanism of how to use it is still quite weak. So a lot of money is actually backed up.
So can I kind of summarize? So the national policies are not somewhat there, or they're there. It's just like how it's being implemented.
Right. In some ways, we're still learning from our decentralization, right? So there's still a lot of knowledge transfer and sort of capacity that needs to be strengthened in the local governments, in the around the region.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of this, in some ways, this is reflective of the way that our brain terrain happens.
Yeah.
All the smart people wants to work at the ministry level. So they're producing these incredible policies, and white papers at that level. But translating it to the ground has been very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of national level, as we were just saying, obviously we're entering into a new phase of government, with new leaders in the parliament. Obviously we still have Jokowi, but potentially new ministers. What are some of your hopes and dreams about what Indonesia can do to fight climate change and to build better, more resilient cities?
I think there has to be acceleration of action.
Mm-hmm.
The urgency needs to be set not just at the top level of governance, but also across the country. So I think that level of awareness needs to be done.
What can the average person or listener or people do?
That is a very good question, because I think that's something very immediate, right? And in terms of mitigating emissions, I think it's quite simple. I think we should consider less motorized transportation when we can.
Yeah.
Right? Like, just managing our waste better, use less plastic, right? And be considerate about water as well.
Yeah.
So I think there are many things that you could do from day to day. And this is something that has been drilled into us even when we were young, right? There's been a lot of campaigns so we should just keep continuing that. The understanding that sort of the branding of climate change has changed now, but it's no different than 30 years ago when on TV you still see things like save water, right?
And how can we become more active citizens? Like, what are the things we can support? Like what movements in Indonesia?
We do have senators, but we do have DPRD. Like there are our regional parliament members,
Right.
or even just our community leaders. Be involved in your Kelurahan Musrenbang, the participatory budgeting forums, right? And I think that's how you become an engaged citizen.
Tweet at your local anggota DPRD. Like, what is your policy on climate change? And what are you doing to advocate for us?
Yeah, I'm sure they'd love those kind of questions. Anyways, Barry, do you have anything else you want to add that we haven't covered in our conversation?
Yeah, actually, that's, this sounds pretty gloomy because I think we do have to realize that even with all these preventative measures, like mitigation measures that we need to consider things like reducing energy emissions and, our everyday activities, things are still going to change.
Yeah.
The climate is still going to change, and we still need to adapt, at least in the medium to long term. So we do still need to act very quickly as well to invest in measures so that we can become more resilient in our cities.
So does that mean like not building more in areas closer to shore? Like what?
See, those types of measures are quite tricky. I think it's not so much about not building close to shore, right? Again, because the issues are not just preventing floods or sea level rise, but it's about how do you live in a denser environment? How do you sort of invest more in public transportation, right? How do you invest more in water management?
How do you truly adapt, right, to this new reality?
Yeah, actually, climate change will also change the nature of our jobs.
Yeah.
Right? Coastal cities will be impacted, and so are coastal industries.
There's job losses. People who are fishermen it'll be harder for them to fish, and they'll need to find alternative employment. And how can we help them access a new job market?
Right, exactly. And agriculture is also being affected. So I think there are many things that we have to consider. And why wouldn't same thing as a green new economy is also a viable employment pathway if we invest in that direction.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Barry, for coming on to this episode and talking to us about, albeit a depressing topic, but a necessary one. And, Stephanie and I both want to feature people doing good work and great work that might not always be visible in the mainstream. And I think you and Kota Kita are doing amazing work. So for our listeners who want to support you and want to find out more about you, how can they do that?
Follow us, check out our website at www.kotakita.org, or I think nowadays we're more active in our Instagram at Kota Kita org.
Do you have volunteer opportunities? Is there a way people can involve?
Yes, actually we are looking for people right now. We are getting very busy and active, and we are looking for volunteers, interns, and people who want to join us, to build our team together. So we're expanding. We're hiring 6 people in a month. We're currently hiring program officers that will be contributing to our climate change and urban resilience programs.
Yeah.
We're active in 7 different cities, including cities in Laos and Cambodia.
So what are the other cities besides?
Semarang, Sleman, Banjarmasin, Bima, Pontianak, Manado, and then Samna in Laos, and Krache in Cambodia.
So yeah, if you are listeners from those areas, go to kotakita.org.
And find out more about these opportunities, and you can get literally involved in fighting climate change.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. You can find more information and resources of whatever we talked about on our website, dialogika.id.
Music credits to John Dealey, Lee Roosevelt, and of course, Broke for Free.
If you like what you hear and want to support us, please review our podcast on the Apple Podcast app or whatever app you use to listen to your podcast. And please share our podcast with your friends. It's the best way to spread the word about Dialogika.
If you want to get more involved, we'd love to hear from you. Our email is dialogikapodcast@gmail.com, or just shoot us a message on our Facebook page.
You can also find us on Instagram, YouTube, SoundCloud, and now Twitter. Please follow us on these various platforms. Our Twitter handle is @DialogikaPod. Also, follow me on Twitter. It's Steph Tank. That's STEPHTANGK.
Thank you again, and see you guys next time.
Bye!